ZA. My original amendment at committee stage was unbalanced. I accept that. I sought to protect female offenders but neglected to account for the small minority of trans women who might face unacceptable risk if housed in male prisons. My new amendment aims to afford appropriate protection to all prisoners, notwithstanding that there can be no guarantee that every prisoner will be entirely protected from risk, even within their own single-sex units. Now, I do wish to thank my noble friend, the Lord Wolfson, for our meetings, for the teaching he organised, and for our ongoing discussions. Now, your Lordships may ask, why have I brought back an amendment? Because this is an important issue in its own right. The needs of women in prison matter, and these needs mandate single-sex provision. Women in prison are acknowledged to be an exceptionally vulnerable group and cannot simply choose to use a different space which remains single-sex. Now, these reasons were discussed in the previous debate, and I shall not repeat them. But this is also representative of the wider issue, my Lords, that of the ability of legislation to maintain single-sex spaces for women. The female estate is a definitive example of a space that should be single-sex. If women in prison cannot be guaranteed single-sex spaces, then no woman or girl can. Hospital wards, changing rooms, rape crisis centre, refugees, toilets in schools, anywhere where women and girls, for reason of dignity, privacy and safety, require single-sex spaces. And I simply say this to my noble friend: if legislation is insufficient at the moment to secure single-sex provision for women in prison, then all females in this country are left vulnerable. Since my previous amendment, I have received a great many letters from both men and women. An amendment to secure the rights of women in prison to single-sex spaces has wide support across a cross-section of the general public. Media coverage continually indicates that the general public supports single-sex spaces for women and girls. Most recently, the article last week in the Times by my honourable friend, Jackie Doyle-Price MP, called for women's prisons to become single-sex once more. Quite rightly, people see this as an important issue in its own right, but they recognise that it is representative of the wider issue. This amendment matters not just to women in prison, but for all women and girls. The strength of evidence indicates that male and female prisoners should be housed separately. This is normal international practice, including our own prison rules. Now, when the policies that permit some trans women prisoners, who are, of course, are of the male sex, to be housed alongside women in the female estate were put in place, this was essentially a live experiment a few years ago. It was not grounded in data. No data demonstrated that the acceptability or the impact on women in prison and on the operation of the female estate. In fact, research recently conducted on behalf of the Scottish Prison Service demonstrates that female offenders are negatively impacted when they are housed with trans women prisoners. This is notwithstanding the MOJ assertion that operational staff perceive that the policies are working well. Now, I am very pleased that the Ministry of Justice has committed to exploring opportunities for research in this area. It was also clear, my Lords, from the teaching that the MOJ believes that the ability to act differently to the current policies is constrained by current legislation. I shall not argue on this point, but if real change is to be effected, then legislative change is or may be necessary. Now, the purpose of the Gender Recognition Act was to legally recognise the acquired gender of transsexual people in specific sets of circumstances in line with a judgment of the European Court of Human Rights. The GRA contains within it supplementary provisions in sections 23 and 24, which empower the Secretary of State to modify the effect of a gender recognition certificate by order. As the explanatory notes to the GRA acknowledge the possibility that, at the time of passing of the GRA, there were circumstances where its unintended consequences for people might not have been then realised. I suggest, my Lords, that the allocation of trans women prisoners with a GRC to the female estate is one such situation, and that legislation to exclude these prisoners from the female prison estate on the basis of their sex, not their gender reassignment, is both possible and warranted. The intention of the GRA was not to render the provisions of separate sex and single-sex services for females an impossibility, to replace sex with gender, or to deny the sex differences between men and women. Neither was the inclusion of gender reassignment protection as a separate protected characteristic in the Equality Act of 2010. The undesirability of that should be self-evident, my lords. Now, a variety of concerns in respect of the previous amendment were raised by noble lords and at the teach-in we had. These related to the vulnerability of trans women and their safety, the ability of trans women to live in their acquired gender, and the undesirability of housing trans women prisoners far from their families. My lords, no one wishes to place any prisoner at an acceptable risk of harm. Vulnerability exists through the male estate, and although female offenders characteristically exhibit particular vulnerabilities, this does not exclude the possibility that the vulnerability of some male prisoners, including trans women, may be equally high. The question for all of us is how to keep trans women safe, and that's very important. However, that is wholly separate to the question, who has the legitimate entitlement to be housed in the female estate? I accept, my lords, that for some trans women, allocation to the male estate will not be appropriate and should not happen. My revised amendment means that Her Majesty's Prison Service will be able to assess trans women on a case-by-case basis and make decisions concerning allocation in consideration of all known risks. The wishes of the individual prisoner can be considered as in the present policy concerning transgender prisoners. Where a prisoner cannot be housed safely in either the general population of the male estate or with other males on a vulnerable prisoners unit, the decision can be made to house that prisoner in a specialist transgender unit. This will ensure their safety from male prisoners. There will be no access to or association with female prisoners. That would not be possible. But access to women in prison is not needed to keep these prisoners safe. It's removing them from the presence of men that is required to keep them safe, not putting them in a woman's prison. Now, I note that the MOJ states that 94% of trans women are housed on the male estate. This means that the safety of the overwhelming majority of trans women can be met in men's prisons. Now, again, at the teach-in, the Ministry of Justice indicated that trans women may obtain a GRC whilst housed in the male estate. It would seem, my lords, that means that they're able to satisfy the requirement of living as a woman for a period of 2 years to the satisfaction of the Gender Recognition Panel. The overwhelming majority of trans women are housed in the male estate, meaning that their needs of women and their rights to live in their acquired gender can be met in men's prison. Certainly, specialist transgender units for women, which I advocate, should be run according to the female regime and providing the canteen for female prisons. A concern was also raised that dedicated transgender units would leave trans women far from their families. Now, this is not an issue that only affects trans women. A 2016 Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons report found that distance from family was a common barrier to visits throughout the prison estate. Women are particularly affected. There are around 10 times the number of men's prisons in England and Wales than women's prisons, and female offenders are more likely to be held at a distance from their families than men. A 2019 report stated that women are typically held at distances that are over 20% further away from their families than men. Some women are held at considerable distances from their families. As there's no female prison in Wales, women may be held over 150 miles from home. Prisoner allocation to specialist units may take place even though this results in increased distance from family. Allocation of trans women to E-Wing at Downview is an example. Trans women prisoners who find themselves housed far away from family should be assisted. Financial help is already available from the Assisted Prison Visit Unit to facilitate visits from close relatives and partners of prisoners who are on low income. I propose expanding this provision for trans women who are held far from family. The number of trans women prisoners currently held in the female estate is very small, suggesting that the number who may be held on specialist transgender units would also be very, very small. The additional financial costs would therefore be modest indeed. The transgender prison population is growing, my lords. Data released by the MOJ at the end of last year indicate a 20% increase in the population of transgender prisoners since 2019. Their needs in prison will become more pressing. The commitment to building new estate, as outlined in the prison's white paper, provides the opportunity to provide that transgender prisoners are properly and appropriately accommodated. New secure units can be tailored to their needs and vulnerabilities. These needs and the operation of specialist transgender units should be a focal point for the so-called future regime design, with outcome frameworks to reflect this. As part of the trauma-responsive approach to women's custody and the female offender strategy, we must recommit to keeping women's prisons single-sex. My Lords, I conclude with a quote from page 54 of the new Prisons White Paper. It says, quote, "We know that women in prison need to address their trauma and its effects if they are to engage with rehabilitative services to turn their lives around," unquote. My Lords, I submit that the possibility for rehabilitation of female offenders should not be compromised. My Lords, it does not turn their lives around if, as was acknowledged in the judgment of FDJ versus SSJ, these women are living in a state of fear and anxiety. My amendment ensures that the needs for privacy, dignity and safety of all prisoners can be met. I commend my amendment to the House.
Amendment proposed, insert the following new clause as set out on the marshalled list.
My Lords, I was very glad to add my name to my noble friend Lord Blencathra's amendment, which he has moved with, I think, a very convincing and passionate speech. And I agreed with him wholeheartedly in all he said. My own views were, in fact, reinforced in the last debate, when the noble and learned Lord MacDonald of River Glavin talked about his visits to women's prisons in rather chilling terms. And I've heard similar accounts from others, both within your Lordship's house and outside. And it seems to me that we add to the uncertainty, the mental tension, the fear, and all those other things if we house those who are physically male but who proclaim themselves female in women's prisons. Of course, the safety of a prisoner, no matter what sex, is important to us all. And it's a point that some of us touched on in the debate on committee stage. And I put forward then a suggestion that perhaps these people should be separately treated and looked after. After all, the aim of prison, and I had 2 prisons in my former constituency, is often lost sight of. Sending to prison is the punishment and rehabilitation is the aim. And you're much more likely to get rehabilitation if the atmosphere is calm, subdued, and there isn't a rampant fear in the prison. And so I believe very strongly, as does my noble friend Lord Blencathra, that the solution is to treat those who are particularly vulnerable in a way in which we take as many safeguards against their vulnerability as possible. And that, to me, leads logically to a solution where those who were born as women and who are women are in women's prisons, and those who are still physically male are, if necessary, housed in a separate unit. And I don't buy the talk of the travelling of great distances any more than my noble friend Lord Blencathra. Of course, the aim should always be to try and have prisoners as close as possible to their loved ones, the community they know, but it isn't always possible. Lord Blencathra referred to the fact that there is no woman's prison in Wales. And so a woman sentenced to jail can be 150 or more miles away. And of course, we also have to remember that people are sent to prison because they have done something which is detrimental to society. Maybe it's a heinous crime, maybe it's not such a heinous crime. But having to travel a certain distance may be part of the price one has to pay. Of course, I'm a great believer in community restorative justice. I believe we send far too many people, both male and female, to prison. And we should be much more adventurous in the way we treat those who are not, by their physical violence, an obvious danger to society. Of course, they must be securely housed wherever and whatever they are. But, my lords, I am also grateful to my noble friend, the minister. I attended the teach-in on Zoom. If only we could have all sat down together, it would have been much better, but it was on Zoom. I don't doubt for a moment my noble friend the minister's passionate commitment, but I had to say to him on the day that I was wholly unconvinced. And I think he respected that. And I really do believe that we have to grasp this particular problem. Like my noble friend Lord Blencathra, I had dozens of letters and messages from those who had listened to, and it's remarkable how many people suffer from insomnia in this country, who had listened to the debate and who wanted to say thank you for standing up for womanhood, for motherhood, and not making us feel disparaged. And of course, we went through this last year when we had that extraordinary maternity bill to give, quite reasonably, maternity leave to the Attorney General, but a bill that was designed to give maternity leave didn't mention the word woman or mother until it had left your lordship's house, where we did indeed talk a little sense into it. My lords, this is something that we have to grasp as a society, and I believe it is totally wrong to put women in a threatened position by having housed next to them people who are still physically male. Protect them all, yes, but in particular have regard for the women. And I believe that the amendment that Lord Blencathra has put before us this evening is worthy of your lordship's support. And if it doesn't receive it tonight, this is an issue that will not go away. And it's a series of big accidents waiting to happen if we're not careful. My lords, I'm glad to give support to my noble friend's amendment.
My lords, I'm very happy to stand up for womanhood and motherhood, but this amendment is very puzzling indeed. What it would mean is that even if a person born male has lived as a woman for 20 years, even if they've undergone sex reassignment surgery, even if they have a gender recognition certificate, even if they are assessed as posing no risk whatsoever to other women, the Home Office would be obliged either to place them in a men's prison or to put them in specially segregated facilities. The former, putting them in a men's prison, would be a disaster. It would obviously be enormously dangerous to such a person. To place them in specially segregated facilities would be demeaning. It would fail to recognise what legislation in this country has recognised for the last at least 15 years, that persons who happen to be born in the wrong sex deserve our compassion and deserve recognition of their position. These issues, I suggest to the House, are far better addressed, as they are at the moment, by Home Office policy, which considers the circumstances of the individual case rather than by broad amendments of this nature, however the good faith of those who put them forward.
Support warmly what my noble friend Lord Panic has just said. I think it's a great mistake, certainly at this stage in our affairs, to attempt to legislate in this matter. It may be that the prison estate is big enough in years to come where one can segregate by gender reassignment, gender reassignment in special prisons of their own, but we're nowhere near that at the moment. And the proper way to deal with this is to rely on the discretion which exists at the present moment. My Lords, it's quite striking if you look at the wording of the amendment. It makes no distinction as to whether we're talking about male or female. And there are very different situations that arise, whichever of these two characteristics you're considering. It makes no distinction for the time that the person may have lived in that new assignment. And it makes no distinction either for the extent of the surgery, the appearance of the person that has gone on over some time as the reassignment process takes place. My Lords, I think it's very difficult for us, those of us who I assume have not faced this problem, to appreciate the intense emotional problem that people who believe that they've been born into the wrong sex have to undergo. It's a very, very emotional matter, fighting against characteristics which you've acquired, which you don't really belong to you. And the way you deal with it is that you believe that you are actually of the sex, of the gender, I should say, that you think you should have been. And that involves not only reconstruction of the body, but it also involves a mentality which is designed entirely to live the new life which you believe is the life you should have been given. And it strikes me as very cruel, if I can use that expression, to treat these people as if they had not reassigned themselves. It's not a choice. It's something to which they're driven by the characteristics which they acquired, which forced them into this decision that they took. But Lords, I make these points just to emphasize that we're dealing here with a very, very difficult problem. And the offender acquires as much consideration on grounds of safety and also for emotional distress as the people around them in the prison in which they're placed. So, legislation is not the way to go, certainly not at the moment, and I personally have complete confidence in the way that the prison authorities are dealing with this very difficult problem at the moment.
Lords, I'd like to welcome this amendment, and I commend Lord Blencathra in particular for doggedly sticking with this issue. I'd also like to thank the noble Lord Wolston of Tregeaga for organising the MOJ teaching, which I found very interesting, useful. I learnt a lot and I listened hard. I thought this amendment was actually a nuanced and sensitive way of dealing with all of the objections raised by the MOJ at that teaching. So I'm rather disappointed that the government haven't accepted Lord Blencathra's proposal, which is a bespoke amendment that protects women's single-sex spaces while sympathetically and practically managing any particular difficult challenges faced by trans women prisoners. The amendment might be a modest proposal, I think it is, but my Lords may be interested that it has created a huge amount of interest outside of this place over the last couple of days. Maybe people on Twitter might look at #KeepPrisonSingleSex. It's been trending for the last 36 hours, but do look, because actually the messages on there are what I'm talking about rather than that it's trending. And I just wanted to read a few tweets that could maybe help us understand why this amendment matters. One, I find it quite baffling that this is even up for discussion. How did we get to a point where we need a debate to include legislation to prevent something so damaging to women, says one. Another says women in UK prisons must not be locked in with convicted male criminals. This is an appalling failure of the duty of care the state has for female prisoners. Female prison staff must not be forced to search male prisoners. Let's hope the House of Lords shows sense. I'd like to think the House of Lords would as well, but maybe not. The final one I want to read out is it says, I've been to prison and I'm telling you now that for some women it's their only safe space due to abuse on the outside. Allowing anyone who claims to feel like a woman to be put in that safe space is wrong. Women, criminal or not, deserve to feel safe. And I say hear, hear to that. And I quoted that last tweet because I think it's important to consider what female prisoners think about this issue. At the teaching, the MOJ, and in fact a couple of comments from already, contributions from our noble lords, were keen to reassure us, the MOJ at the teaching, that operational staff say that policies are working well. But I think we have to say, who says they're working well and who are they working well for? I've been told by women prisoners I'm in contact with, or have been in contact with, and indeed female prisoners officers, that they're not so happy with the arrangements and are concerned, and that's why I read out that tweet. But all of this anyway is hearsay, isn't it? It's just what I'm saying or what a tweet says or what indeed the MOJ say about operational success. The whole area would benefit from government commissioning some independent research. I wondered whether my lords had seen the research published in the British Journal of Criminology recently and reported in the Times. It was researched by Dr. Matthew Maycock, a former employee of the Scottish Prison Service, and it contained some valuable insights. For example, female prisoners interviewed suggested that some of those who identified as women while incarcerated with them had reverted back to identifying as males again on release. Also, the research revealed that female officers in Scotland feel uncomfortable at being forced to do intimate body searches of prisoners who still have male genitalia. And to note on a freedom of information request on that, because we've heard of instances of people living for many years as having transitioned, that in that freedom of information request, it revealed that of the 12 trans-identifying prisoners convicted of violent and sexual crimes and housed in Scottish women's jails, only one had undertaken medical and surgical transition. So can we please remember that what we're talking about is something that's slightly different than has been described. Unfortunately, the Scottish Prison Board has not used that research and have decided to develop their own policy, preferring to conduct their own research, which I'm not sure about. But anyway, I know that the UK government are keen on expert advice, and I'm delighted to hear that the Minister is going to look at more research, because there really are some great academic and independent experts out there who could really shine some light on what is really going on in prison and how prison policy is working or not as far as prison officers and prisoners are concerned. During the debate initiated by Lord Blencathra at the committee stage and also at the teaching, I felt that all of the spotlight was on the welfare and rights of the trans women prisoners rather than on women prisoners. And whenever some of us raised the welfare and rights of women prisoners, they were almost treated as somehow secondary. For example, we were told that the female prisoners shouldn't worry about sharing quarters with transgender prisoners because those transgender prisoners would have been through a risk assessment process. But that risk assessment process is all about which transgender prisoners are assessed as being suitable to be managed safely on the women's estate. This puts the focus of risk vis-à-vis an institution's organisational capacity rather than the risk to women or indeed how women might feel about it. It was also argued that this present policy is necessary because a minority of trans women could face unacceptable risk if housed in male prisons. And we've heard that, again, described by a couple of noble lords. Of course these prisoners should be protected and kept safe. But let's be honest, they aren't the only group of male prisoners who face risk or violence on the male estate. Vulnerable young men also can face violent bullying, even rape, sexual assault. Look at the levels of self-harm in the male estate. Such a problem that suicide watch is too often an everyday reality for too many frightened male prisoners on the male estate. This, of course, is unacceptable, and the solution should be to make the male estate safer and fit for purpose for all, perhaps tackling overcrowding, understaffing, etc. What the solution should not be, in any instance of any vulnerable male prisoner feeling unsafe on the male estate, is to move said male prisoners into the women's estate. To remind us that the purpose of women's prisons is not to protect vulnerable males, and women shouldn't be buffers or victims of the men's prison service's inability to protect vulnerable male prisoners. Now, I know that some of you may well be feeling uncomfortable that I'm using the word male to describe transgender women. Such is the muddle we've got into in terms of conflating sex and gender. I was doing that to emphasise their sex, rather than to be offensive or cause any problems. But such is the weight of coercive control and political pressure around identity politics that it can be difficult sometimes to state biological truth. And the biological truth is this: sex and gender are distinct. Sex is recognised in the law as the basis of women's rights. The prison estate is separated according to sex. Unless the government are advocating mixed-sex prison, women should have the expectation that they won't be locked up or housed with males. Any male who wishes to transition is free to do so. And in a tolerant society, I'd expect our approach to be: wear what you want, change your names, pronouns as you like, of course express your gender identity. However, none of this changes someone's sex, and people should not have the expectations of the same rights as women as a sex. If any trans prisoners are mistreated in the male estate, prison authorities should punish perpetrators and protect the victims, of course. But we need to untangle this humane response from the often bullying demand that we deny biological reality, or that the rights of transgender women can be used to sideline women's rights to single-sex provision. An important, hard-fought-for right, which I, as a woman, am not prepared to sell out just for political expediency or because it's unpopular. If necessary, special provision should be made for transgender prisoners, of course, and maybe the details, as people have described, are not what one would want. I think that, however, an attempt at resolving this in a humane way is why this amendment is so important. It's practical, it's a pragmatic solution for transgender prisoners who feel unsafe on the male estate, but it does not force women to give up their rights or compromise women and same-sex provision on the women's estate.
My Lords, I rise to speak against this amendment and would remind, I think we should remind ourselves, when we talk about trans women and trans men, we are talking about men and women who have faced very difficult choices about their identity and whom they believe themselves to be. Once they face that choice and decide to transition, the transition is a very lengthy process. And again, is not undertaken lightly because, as we have heard, and as is so often the case, it leads to gender reassignment. I occasionally go on Twitter, and I have read the tweets, and I have received messages from people who, in relation to what we're discussing tonight, have said that they, if they thought they were going to prison as a trans woman or a trans man, that they would rather commit suicide than face what they believed would be inhumane treatment within the United Kingdom prison service. My Lords, we have to deal with these fears. We're being asked to deal with fears on both sides of this argument, and I want us to deal with both of them equally. The balancing of rights always poses for us the greatest problem. But I believe the Ministry of Justice, in its policy on assessing trans prisoners, has got it absolutely right. It is late, my lords. We have other important work to do. So I will begin to wind up, but I wish to associate myself wholeheartedly with the comments of the noble and learned Lord Hope and the noble and learned Lord Panic. I could go through the policy section by section as to why I believe it's right. I'm not going to do that, my lords, but if your lordships wished to return to it, I would so do. I will finish on these reflections. This amendment, even though it has been placed in good faith and, as the mover said, with good intention, deeply concerns me because it perpetrates the stereotype of trans women and trans men as sexual predators, full stop, as a threat to other women and indeed trans men, as a threat to the wider society. It also, I believe, as was said in an earlier debate in relation to the previous amendment, it creates further inequalities, my lords. It does not reduce them.
My lords, I write to support this amendment. And the first thing I want to say is that we're only talking about men who did not transition into women, which is quite different. And although we have come a long way since the Corsten report in 2007 to improve conditions for women in prisons, we're now failing them. Indeed, something has recently gone badly wrong. Women prisoners have a right to the security of a single-sex space. By definition, women are deprived of this security if men are admitted to their prison, including trans women prisoners of male sex, whether or not they have the benefit of a GRC. By the same token, a woman's prison is no place for vulnerable, at-risk males. Prison policy must provide for the protection of everybody. And this amendment makes this clear. How then have we allowed prison policy to be captured by a concern for the protection of trans prisoners at the cost of imprisoned women, most fundamental rights? There is no balance or fairness in that. The answer is, of course, that the government department have allowed themselves to be influenced, even intimidated, by noisy and modish pressure groups, whose willful ignorance of basic science has all the features of a cult. I have never visited a prison. I have never been to a prison myself, but as a woman, I can just imagine how it must be to be incarcerated and threatened. So on this note, I very much support this amendment, and I thank Lord Blencathra, Lord Farmer, and Lord Cormack for tabling this amendment.
My Lords, I have visited
a number of prisons, both women's prisons and male prisons, and I've also sat where the noble Lord Wolfson sits, and I've answered a number of questions about the difficult question about where you house those who have transitioned or purport to transition usually from the male gender to the female gender. It's an incredibly difficult task that the ministry has to perform. It's one which requires assessment. It's one that requires nuance. As a young barrister, I had the privilege of representing April Ashley, who died about 3 weeks ago, a pioneer in this field. She had changed
from a man to a woman. She had had pioneering surgery in North Africa. She had lived successfully as a woman for 30 years when she was arrested by the police and thrown into a male jail. She was philosophical about the unfair charge. She was less philosophical about the desperately inconsiderate approach that was shown by the police. The noble Lord Panic referred to those who'd lived for 20 or 30 years. This amendment, I'm afraid, would deal with that sort of situation. I know it's well meant and it acknowledges the difficulties, but really to legislate in this area, I suggest that would be extremely inappropriate.
My Lords, one of the main reasons that I put my name again to this now revised amendment in the name of my noble friend Lord Blencathra is that I was not persuaded by the Minister's assurances given at committee stage that risks are properly balanced before a trans woman is housed in the female prison estate. First, I heard no mention of the consideration not just of physical harm coming to female prisoners, but also the risks of introducing high levels of fear and anxiety by accepting male-bodied, female-identifying persons into the prison. More than half of female prisoners have experienced domestic violence. We've heard that this evening already in the previous debate, the vast majority of which will surely have been at the hands of men. A case board investigating the risk a trans woman presents will not be looking through the filter of trauma, abuse and male exploitation which many imprisoned women apply to their surroundings. I undertook several prison visits for my MOJ commissioned review of the female estate. As was typical, I questioned a panel of prisoners. On one visit, the de facto leader who dominated the proceedings was obviously male and not attempting to pass as a woman. This transgender prisoner might not have been exerting sexually charged and motivated power, but there was a palpable imbalance all the same. Second, Ministry of Justice policy is not in step, as we've heard this evening, with public opinion at all. A poll conducted by Women for Women UK found that when respondents were asked if intact male-bodied trans women should be housed in a women's prison, support slumped to net disapproval of -20%. Contrary to public perception, the overwhelming majority of male-born transgender people retain their penis and are fully male-bodied. Moreover, a 2016 meta-analysis established that less than 3% of the transgender population is undergoing any gender-affirming surgical or hormonal treatment, with the remaining 97% simply self-identifying with no modifications to their natal sex body at all. The argument that the noble and learned Lord Panic made that the trans woman prisoner, whom these policies are designed to protect, may have been living in their acquired gender for very many years, have had full reassignment surgery and treatment, passed perfectly as a woman, and have been convicted of a minor non-violent offence, and that to refuse to house this prisoner in the female estate would be wholly unjustified. But the statistics I have just given, and my own understanding and albeit limited experience of transgender prisoners housed in women's prisons, lead me to ask, is this description really characteristic of the population of trans women prisoners, including those held in the female estate? This example of a transgender prisoner seems divorced from reality and from the prisoners female offenders are forced to contend with on a daily basis. It is perplexing why prison policy is formulated to account for a situation that may never transpire, exposing female offenders to prisoners who are very far removed from that hypothetical. Rona Hotchkiss, a prison governor from Scotland, who is deputy in a men's prison initially pushed for trans women to be housed in the female estate, became deeply concerned at how this practice played out when she became governor of Cornton Vale. A prisoner transferred from the male estate when they identified as a woman, then re-identified as a man after a short time in Cornton Vale. Frustrated by the delay, whilst the Scottish Prison Service deliberated, the prisoner threatened to rape other prisoners and staff. Hotchkiss was deeply shaken, thinking, what woman threatens to rape other people, a crime for which a penis is required? And also, why should we take people's word for this? We don't for anything else. This, to me, strikes at the heart of the issue. We are giving the benefit of a doubt to people who identify as women, yet have all their male hormones and physicality intact. We are giving them access to female spaces, despite the benefits to and rights of women to have sex-specific prisons. This amendment has broader implications. It speaks to the necessity of upholding the fundamental rights and freedoms of women and girls on the basis of sex, not gender, as recognised in UK and international law. This is not simply a disagreement between the government and those of us who have spoken to the amendment. It is a difference in point of principle between the government and large swathes of the electorate, as polling indicates. Gender does not take precedence over sex. Males do not take precedence over females. The protected characteristic, gender reassignment, does not take precedence over the protected characteristic, sex. To summarise, in the prison context, male hormones and a male sex organ surely present considerable risk to vulnerable women for the varied reasons I give above, which include perceived threat to mental safety and actual threat of domination and exploitation, not just the objective risk of physical and sexual harm. I support my noble friend's amendment.
My Lords, I refer to my interests in the register and want to make it clear that I'm not expressing any opinion on the merits of this particular amendment. But I hope the noble Lord, in winding up, because the debate has ranged far and wide beyond actually the amendment, and because there appears to be some misunderstanding in the House as to what the amendment is, so I hope when he stands to speak to this amendment that he will clarify two important factors. I wonder whether he would tell the House whether housing a trans woman holding a gender recognition certificate on the male estate would be unlawful, as that woman is legally a woman. That's quite an important distinction, and it hasn't come out. There's clearly a misunderstanding there. The second point I'd like him to clarify would be that housing a trans woman on a male estate or a trans man on a woman's estate could be unlawful, as it could amount to discrimination.
My Lord, I wonder if I might just amplify somewhat more bluntly the points made by my two noble learned friends, and indeed Lord Fawkes and Lord Cashman. I simply have been to prison as a member of the Cursler Trust, trying to take arts in there. And one of the things that struck me was, and in a way the arts was a release for this, was the sort of fevered testosterone that exists. We've heard about it from both sides. Now, I ask you to imagine, just for one moment, what would happen to somebody who was incarcerated in a male prison, already appears, shall we use this word, effeminate, but maybe even more, has been sexually adapted to being a woman. I cannot even begin to think how that person would be targeted in a male prison. And I really think we need to think very carefully about that, whatever the merits of Lord Blencathra's amendment.
My Lords, I draw attention to my interests as declared in the register. I do find myself to be somewhat perplexed by this debate and the amendment. My noble friend Baroness Mayer said we are only talking about men who did not transition. But I don't think the amendment does say that. I think the amendment is clear in that it says where a person who has undergone gender reassignment. So there appears to be some misunderstanding about what the effect of the amendment would be. And I wonder what the problem is that we are trying to fix. After all, my noble friend Lord Blencathra himself said that the number of transgender women in the women-only estate is, and I quote, very small. We know that in practice, the vast majority of transgender prisoners are already held in prisons which match their sex registered at birth. And the small number who are not held in such places have been risk assessed. But as the noble Lord Panic pointed out, that risk assessment would count for nothing in relation to transgender women, because the effect of this amendment would be to say that there are no circumstances, irrespective of risk, in which such women, who may have been women for some time, may be held in the women-only estate. It doesn't matter that the authorities believe that they pose no risk whatsoever. It doesn't matter that the numbers that we're talking about are actually very low. What matters to the movers of this amendment is that the law should say that they should never be held in such a wing. And, my lords, I think that that is in principle wrong. It seems to me to be the sense of the whole House that people should be held according to the appropriate accommodation after a risk assessment. And that might well mean that trans women are not held in the women-only estate. It might well mean that trans men are not held in the male-only estate, but that it would be better, it is better, that there is a risk assessment and they are held in the appropriate place. But the effect of this amendment is to prescribe, because the movers of this amendment think that they know better. And that, in the end, is the decision that I think we are confronted with. It's a decision about whether we are to be guided by ideology or whether we are to be guided by pragmatism, and I would suggest compassion as well. It was said in advancing this amendment that a reason to accept it is that absent this amendment being passed, no places could be safe for women, not just in prison, but beyond the prison estate. How can that be? How can it be the effect of this amendment, were we to pass it, that suddenly it would make all other places for women safe? It was also said that there... Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah. I'll give way to the noble lady. I'm so sorry.
I only wanted to clarify, which was in the, if it has an impact on prisons, what it would impact it might have for all women. I think what's at issue is the protection of single-sex facilities, single-sex places that are single-sex only, and that is a very important principle, no matter how small the numbers are in this instance, that there is concern about. So I'm at least clarifying why it is that people say it. And it's not just people in this House who say it. This is a widespread concern. Sorry. So I'm just...
I'm grateful to the noble lady. I think we can agree that it's important that women should be safe. And the Equality Act provides exemptions in a number of scenarios, including in relation to women-only spaces outside the prison estate, to ensure that it allows the prison authorities to make the right judgments about where it is appropriate to place people. The safety of people is put first, and so it should be. My lords, may I just say this in conclusion? It's been suggested that a reason to pass this amendment is because of the media coverage that this debate has excited, that outside of this place there is a tremendous wave of anger, and that we need to pay attention to it. Of course, if people's fears are provoked, if there are media campaigns that suggest that women cannot be safe, then there will be such fervent outrage. But that is not a reason for us to depart from the facts. And the facts do not lend support to this approach, which places ideology above pragmatism. And I would therefore urge the government not to accept this amendment.
I really didn't want to speak today because whatever I say, I'm going to get abuse. But I have been so incensed by some of the contributions today. And I would just like to point out in an absolutely non-specific way that the majority of speakers have been male and they have spoken against the amendment. The two women who've spoken, or the two two women have spoken for the motion because they perceive there is a problem. Now, my party's policy is that trans men are men and trans women are women, and I don't have a problem with that. But the fact is, there are occasions when women in women's prisons are experiencing sexual predation by men who have falsely self-ID'd as women. And the Noble Lord Cashman said, we're saying that all trans women are sexual predators. We are absolutely not saying this. Of course we aren't saying that. But in closing, I would like to ask the Noble Lord the Minister if he would just clarify, do trans men go to male prisons? Because my understanding is they do not, because they would not be safe. And what we're talking about here is keeping people safe, vulnerable people of all kinds. Whatever trans identity they have, whatever sexual identity they have, keeping people safe. Now, clearly, prisons are the worst possible places to keep people safe. They are a nightmare. And this government is increasing the number of prisons. It's not actually trying to reduce the prison population and make our prisons safer. It's actually adding to the problem. So my question is, do trans men go to male prisons? And have there been cases where men have falsely ID'd, self-ID'd as women and predated sexually on women? My understanding, I've had emails and I've had letters from women who have been abused by men who have falsely self-ID'd as women. And so what can we say to these women? We can't say this is an ideology and we're trying to look good on our children. What we have to do is be serious about people who are abused, whether they are male or female, whether they're trans men or trans women. And I would not vote for this amendment because it's too hard-line, as far as I'm concerned. I accept the issue of safe accommodation. That seems very sensible. I don't see that's demeaning at all. Prisons are demeaning. Safe accommodation sounds very safe to me. And, of course, we cannot forget that we as, only men here have spoken against this. Why? Why do men think it's okay? I don't understand. You are actually ignoring the fact that some women are predated upon. And sometimes there might be, I don't know, perhaps they're not telling the truth. I have no idea, but I rather suspect that they are. And so, please, can we just think about the vulnerable people and stop being so ultra-sensitive and supposing that we're all getting at everybody? I'm absolutely fed up with this debate, and I hope this is the last speech.
My Lords, it won't be, because this woman disagrees with this amendment. And I speak as a woman who cares very deeply about the safety and the physical safety of women. And one of the things that I find most objectionable about the campaign which is being run in the media and has been run for the last couple of years is the assumption that those of us who are women, who stand as allies with trans people, don't, because I just don't believe that that is the case at all. It would be very tempting at this stage to answer some of the very wide-ranging points which have been made, polls with leading questions, misinterpretations, misstatements of the law. But I won't do that. I will simply stick to the facts that I think that this House should look at when it is coming to a decision on this matter. The Noble Lord Blencathra spoke about an entitlement of prisoners to go to an estate. There is no such entitlement. The noble Baroness Jones talked about instances when identifying male prisoners had predated upon women. That has happened, but it has not happened, my understanding is that it has not happened since the implementation of the policy, which is now operational and has been operational, I think, since 2016, updated in 2019, in the prison service. There are historic cases, and they are trotted out all the time by people who wish to disparage trans people. Let's absolutely clear what the current policy that is operated in our prisons is. A proper assessment of risk is paramount in the management of all individuals subject to custodial and community sentences. The management of individuals who are transgender, particularly in custodial and AP settings, must seek to protect both the welfare and rights of the individual and the welfare and the rights of other people in custody around them. These two risks must be carefully considered and fully balanced against each other. Decisions must be formed by all available evidence and intelligence in order to achieve an outcome that balances risks and promotes the safety of all individuals in custody. My understanding from talking to prison officials is that not only is there no entitlement for a prisoner to be held in an estate, that risk assessment includes an assessment of whether somebody is attempting to be transferred into an estate in order to perpetrate further crimes. And if they are, that is held as a contraindication. I agree absolutely with the Noble Lord Hope and the Noble Lord Panic. What we have now is a policy which does, as the Noble Baroness Kishore-Faulkner said to us, does bring to the fore the human rights of individuals, but it balances them with the safety of everybody, and that includes the staff as well in prisons. Let's not forget them. And this, therefore, that Lord Blencathra is putting to us is an amendment which is neither based on evidence, and it's a retrograde step. So I would urge noble lords to reject it.
My Lords, I don't intend to repeat the arguments that other noble lords have made and the arguments I made at committee stage. They are in the official record. Existing legislation and procedures properly applied are sufficient to ensure the safety and well-being of all prisoners and staff in our prisons in relation to transgender prisoners, and I am sure the noble Lord the Minister will confirm that. And because I have said, in answer to a suggestion on Twitter, that I felt that the existing risk-based approach was best, I get sent a direct message on Facebook from somebody I have never heard from before, who says, and I quote, "Leave women's rights alone, you nasty little misogynist. We see you loud and clear. Trans rights simply means male rights. Enjoy your irrelevance, MRA bigot," whatever MRA stands for. I have no idea. However, of course, as the noble lady Baroness Fox of Buckley has said, we need to consider the rights of women. Of course we do. And transgender people also have rights, and their rights need to be balanced. And that the best way to do that is to do it on a case-by-case basis. The noble Lady Baroness Mayer and the noble Lord Cormac and the noble Lord Farmer talked extensively about transgender people who had not undergone gender reassignment surgery or transgender women who are still physically men. My Lords, there is nothing at all in this amendment about the physical state of transgender people. It applies blanket to every single transgender person. The fact is, every prisoner entering the prison estate is risk assessed to ensure that they are not a threat to themselves or others, and they are housed and segregated or not on that basis. And if that assessment has been wrong on rare occasions in the past, The problem was not with the system, let alone with the law. It was a problem with the way, it was a problem with implementation. But I understand, and I am sure the noble Lord the Minister will confirm, I understand that that is no longer a problem. This amendment is not necessary and we oppose it.
My Lords, I will be relatively brief as well. Clearly this whole debate is about balancing rights and balancing vulnerabilities. And I've been following this debate over a number of months, if not years. Unfortunately, I didn't go to the teach-in which the noble Lord, Lord Wolfson, organised. However, I have been to other Zoom-related events where I've spoken to prison officers and people involved in managing these situations. The thing which is apparent to me is there have been an evolution of approaches done by the prison officers who manage these and the governors. So I've spoken to a number of them a number of times. And indeed, for one particular female women's prison which I spoke to, they did indeed have transgender units which they were operating for a period, and then they've changed the way they operate it. I have to say, the governors I spoke to seemed, I don't know what the word to say, I don't want to use the word relaxed, but they seemed to think that they could manage the situation. That's what I was told, and I have every reason to believe in their professionalism in trying to deal with a situation which is evolving. As we've heard from noble lords, there is an increase in trans prisoners. I think the figure of 20% since 2019 was mentioned. But I've visited really quite a few prisons over the last 10 years, and I am always impressed by the quality of the prison staff, the governors and the prison officers themselves. And essentially, what I'm saying is I trust them to make the right decision. That's the basis of my view on this. I think they can manage risk. I think they are dealing with very difficult circumstances. And as the noble lady Baroness Barker said, they do have policies which have evolved over a period, which include obviously the safety of all the prisoners themselves, including and of course the safety of staff as well. So, my lords, I was pleased to hear that the noble Lord the Minister in the teach-in has said that he is willing to support further research on this matter. It is an evolving situation. Nevertheless, for my part, I'm content that the current complex case boards which make these difficult decisions should continue to do their work.
My Lords, this amendment relates to the management of transgender prisoners. The result of the amendment would be that transgender prisoners would ordinarily, and that word is used twice in the amendment, be held in a prison matching their sex as registered at birth. I'll come back to that word ordinarily later on. I should first record my sincere thanks to noble Lord Blencathra for his time. I'm pleased that he found the teach-in with officials from the MOJ and also HMPPS helpful. I'm grateful also that my noble friend Lord Cormac and noble Baroness of Fox of Buxley were able to attend that teach-in. I'm conscious from what they said then and this evening that I didn't persuade them at that time. I'm not sure I'm going to persuade them in the next few minutes, but I'm going to give it a go. I'm not proposing, however, to refer to anything said on Twitter. That is despite the fact that I think I'm one of the few ministerial Twitterers, or is it tweeters, around. My tweets have become a lot more dull since joining the front bench, but I can say that on this subject, Twitter exhibits heat and no light whatsoever. So I'm grateful for the relative safety and sanity of your Lordship's House. Under the amendment, transgender prisoners who are not held with prisoners matching their sex as registered at birth would be held in separate accommodation such that they have no contact with people of their acquired gender. That is the inescapable result of the amendment. But I do suggest that it is unnecessary.
Transgender prisoners can already be held in prisons matching their sex as registered at birth, where this is assessed as appropriate. And indeed, in practice, the vast majority of transgender prisoners are already held in prisons matching their sex as registered at birth. And the small number who are held otherwise have been through a rigorous multidisciplinary risk assessment process. And there is already provision, as I'll explain in a moment, for transgender prisoners to be held separately from other prisoners of their acquired gender if doing so is deemed necessary. We take the allocation of transgender prisoners extremely seriously. This is a subject which, as the last hour or so has demonstrated, arouses a lot of controversy and passion. But the approach we've put in place allows us to strike an appropriate balance, and the Noble Lord Cashman put his finger on it. That's the right word. It's a balance between the safety, rights and well-being of transgender prisoners and that of all other prisoners in the estate. And I can assure, therefore, Noble Lady Baroness Fox of Buckley, that we do not only look at the position of the transgender prisoner in this context. The officials who are managing the risk know the risk which can be managed, for example, in the women's estate, and they are balancing the risks and working out what is the best solution. I can also assure my noble friend Baroness Mayer that neither I nor other ministers in the department give in to what she referred to, I think I took this down correctly, as noisy and modish pressure groups. Indeed, if I did, I wouldn't be able to take much of the government's business through your lordship's house. Under the government's current policy, transgender prisoners are initially allocated to a prison matching their legal gender. And as the Noble Lady Baroness Barker set out, this is the way we do it. For most transgender prisoners, this is the same as their sex registered at birth. Most transgender prisoners then remain in a prison matching their sex as registered at birth. Transgender prisoners who have not changed their gender by obtaining a gender recognition certificate are only held in a prison opposite to their sex registered at birth, where that is judged appropriate by a multidisciplinary complex case board which consider all relevant factors. And transgender prisoners who have changed their legal gender can still be moved to a prison matching their sex registered at birth, where a case board judges that to be necessary to manage risk. To come back to the words of the amendment, it's not clear what the word ordinarily would actually mean in practice for those making decisions about transgender prisoners. Our current approach is robust, and over 90% of transgender women in prison are held in the men's prison estate. And so I respectfully agree with my predecessor, if I can call him that, my noble friend Lord Folkes, that this is a nuanced and difficult matter. I also agree with my noble friend Lord Herbert of South Downs that this ought to not to be a matter of ideology. It ought to be a matter of putting into place systems which actually work, and we believe our systems do work. The second part of the amendment suggests a facility be created to hold transgender prisoners who are not to be held in a prison matching their sex as registered at birth, separate from other prisoners. Now, the current policy, in fact, allows for this. There is a small part of HMP Downview, known as the House has heard as E-Wing, which is used for this purpose. This allows transgender women with gender recognition certificates to be held separately with only supervised contact with other women where a complex case board has deemed this to be necessary. And such a board can also recommend that a transgender woman with a GRC can be held in a prison matching their sex at birth where their risk is considered too high to be held in E-Wing. All other high-risk transgender women without GRCs are placed in the male estate. But the amendment would, as we've heard, mean placing all transgender women in the women's estate in E-Wing, even where the board had assessed them at posing a level of risk which could be managed in the women's estate. And we don't think that would be fair or appropriate, essentially for the reasons set out by the Noble Lord Panic. I think, just to correct the record, so to speak, when the Noble Lord referred to the Home Office, he now obviously means the MOJ. But it would, I think, be, to pick up a word which was used, cruel to do so. I agree with the approach of the noble and learned Lord Hope of Craighead, who said that we have to be alive to all the relevant distinctions and various issues which transgender prisoners present with. And we are alive, as the noble Lord Cashman put it, to the risk of suicide. Now, of course, I appreciate the noble Lord's long-standing concerns in this area. I accept that we didn't always get it right in the past. There were, prior to the strengthening of our approach in 2019, a small number of sexual assaults committed by transgender women in the women's estate. But we learnt the lessons of that. Since 2019, there have been no such assaults. But let me just make this point as well. Even if, God forbid, there were such an assault, that would not necessarily mean the policy was wrong. Regrettably, there are assaults in prisons not infrequently. So I'm not going to lay my hat on the line and say as soon as we have an assault, that necessarily means the policy is not working. That would also be a fundamentally mistaken approach. What we do, however, is consider the risks and we put an appropriate policy in place. To pick up the specific questions put by the noble Lady Baroness Falcon of Margravine, it's not unlawful to hold trans women with GRCs in the men's estate. There are already powers in place to do so. Trans women are routinely held in the men's estate, and trans men are routinely held in the women's estate. I think I have therefore answered all the questions that have been put to me. But let me just end on one final point. A number of noble lords have put to me and put to the government that there is public disquiet about this. We have put in place a policy which we think provides for the proper management of transgender prisoners and the proper protection of all women in the women's estate. And I'm not going to make any apology for putting management and protection first and what is said to be public opinion, whether on Twitter or anywhere else, second. Because I'm conscious that in our prisons also we have people who are being found guilty of the most heinous crimes, such as sexual violence against children. And we don't manage those prisoners by the way public opinion might suggest that they be managed. And I think a proper criminal justice system takes account of the considerations which I've set out. And for those reasons, I would invite noble lords to withdraw the amendment.
My Lords, as is normal, while winding up, says it's been an interesting debate. Well, it certainly provoked more interest than I had anticipated. And I wish to thank all my noble friends, Lord Cormac, Lord Farmer, Baroness Mayer, Baroness Fox, Baroness Jones, for their contributions. But first of all, can I start off with the contribution of my noble friend, Lord Herbert. I don't do media. I don't do anti-social media things like Twitter and so on. I'm not motivated to move this out of ideology, nor because of what the media say. I'm motivated to do this because I've been approached by women in prison who were afraid for their safety, rightly or wrongly. Now, he's right to say that it's only a small number of trans women in prisons, but there's a large number of women who are afraid of them. They may be wrong to be afraid, but it is in their interest that I'm working to try and make sure that they no longer have that fear. Now, the noble and learned Lord Panic has said that my amendment would mean that trans women in prison, transgender prisoners, should either be stuffed into the male estate or put into some ghastly, specially segregated facility. He made it sound like something that the apartheid regime would invent. Well, my lords, that's exactly what the current government policy is, the MOJ policy is. All transgender prisoners coming into the prison estate start off in the male estate. I'm not inventing that. That's the current policy, as my noble friend has said. 90% of trans women prisoners stay in the male estate, and then some are moved to the women's estate. And they're moved to a specially segregated facility called E-Wing of Downview. And I'm merely suggesting in my amendment that the facilities of E-Wing in Downview should be extended to house more transgender prisoners. Now, the noble and learned Lord Hope of Craighead, also the noble Lord Panic, I think are acting under the impression that the vast majority of these prisoners have spent a long part of their life as trans women, that they've had hormone replacement therapy, that they've had operations, they've been living as a woman for years. That is not the case, my lords. As we've seen from Scotland, only 1 in 12 has. We don't have the figures for England because they're confidential, and understandably, but the anecdotal evidence is that there is no one in our prisons in England with a GRC who has gone through that process. So they are not those who have lived their lives 20 or 30 years. But I do say to the noble and learned Lord of Craighead, Lord Hope of Craighead, if the government were to go down my route, then I perfectly well accept that a system could be built in where someone who has had hormone replacement therapy, who has had surgery, who has been living as a woman for X number of years, that person may then qualify on a risk assessment basis to be classified as a woman, not in biological terms, but in terms of being sent to prison. And I finally say to the noble Lord Cashman, it is quite wrong to categorise this amendment as stigmatising trans people as a particularly violent class. That is not the case. I made absolutely clear in my speech that trans women prisoners, many of them, could not stay in the male estate because the male prisoners would be violent towards them. They are equally capable or more capable of violence. Now, I accept that the court said that what the prison service is doing is lawful. Well, in the narrow point of law considered by the court, that's correct. And one would hope that the MOJ would not have a policy that deliberately broke the law. But the point of issue here, my lords, is not our ideology. It's that what is lawful and what is morally right part ways. And I do urge the MOJ to accept my solution, which lets trans women prisoners live their lives in prison in safe space and women in theirs. And I simply do not understand why the Lib Dems and the Labour Party and some of my own noble friends now dislike women so much that they're resolutely opposed to defending their hard-won rights. Now, I can see how the government has blundered into this hole, but at least I see signs now from the government party that they've stopped digging. My lords, I'm not going to be successful today, but I say to all my noble friends on the front bench, in all departments, that this policy of downgrading the rights of biological sex women is heading for the scrap heap of history. It's not on the side of science, logic, morality, nor common sense. And everyone outside the political bubble we're in knows that. The battle for common sense and the rights of women will intensify. And I conclude by suggesting that all my noble friends should read, and all ministers, should read the excellent article in the Times last week by my honourable friend Jackie Doyle Price MP. She said, inter alia, quote, "Sex is biological and immutable. Gender is social. The two things are distinct. And by conflating sex with gender, we have created an inevitable conflict between rights based on sex and those assumed by someone with a transgender identity." She said, "We can be inclusive without compromising the rights, dignity and privacy of women." Unquote. Wise words, my lords. Jackie Doyle Price is on the side of common sense and history. So I beg leave to withdraw my amendment, not because I'm wrong, but because I cannot win in the numbers tonight.
Is it your Lordship's pleasure this amendment be withdrawn? Amendment by leave withdrawn.
My Lords, I beg to move that further consideration on the report be now adjourned until a convenient point after 9:22.
The question is that further consideration on report be now adjourned. As many as that opinion shall say content. To the contrary, not content. The contents have it. We'll have a small pause for the change of the front bench. Lords, I think we shall now proceed with questions on a statement made in the House of Commons on Thursday, the 6th of January, on Russia. Lord Tarrant.